In this video, I'm going to talk to you about our ASAD model, which is our aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. I'm going to show you how the curves shift and show how the equilibrium changes in the long run and the short run. So first, let's start off with our typical graph. And we'll have our downward sloping demand curve. This is just the same as in microeconomics. We have downward sloping demand curve, so this is going to be aggregate demand. So we're going to label this AD. And then we're going to have our aggregate supply. You can make it curved or you can make it straight. I'm going to make it straight just for simplicity's sake. Upward sloping aggregate supply curve. And this is going to be our short run supply curve in the short run. So it's SRAS for short run aggregate supply curve. This is our short run curve because in the short run we can have changes to our level of output on the supply side, and in the long run, classical economics assumes that our level of output is fixed. So this is our long run aggregate supply curve. So when you want to look at the long run and the short run, you want to include the two different aggregate supply curves and your aggregate demand curve. Where they meet is where your equilibrium price and quantity will be. So this is our equilibrium price level, where we're starting, and this is our equilibrium output level. I'm going to label it Y for output, and this is, right now, it's an equilibrium in the short run and in the long run. Now there are a few things that can shift our aggregate demand curve and our aggregate supply curve. So aggregate demand curve shifts. They occur when we have things like anything that changes your our output function. Our output function, remember, is Y equals C plus I plus G plus X, where C is consumption, I is investment, G is government spending, and X is net exports. So if there's a change, I'm just going to use the triangle delta for change. There's a change in net exports, that will shift our aggregate demand. If there is a change in government spending, that will shift our aggregate demand. If there is a change in income taxes, that will affect our consumption, which is part of our aggregate demand. And if there's a change in the interest rate, that will affect investment. And all those things make up our aggregate demand curve. So let's take a look at what happens in the short run and the long run if we have a shift in aggregate demand. Let's imagine that government spending increases. So we'll choose that one. So there's an increase in government spending. An increase in government spending will shift out aggregate demand. I'm going to draw a new line, shifting out our aggregate demand curve. Aggregate demand, we'll call this aggregate demand 1. So you see that it's shifted out. Now, when it shifts out in the short run, we're able to increase our output. But this output is beyond our full employment output. So let's label this full employment output, FE for full employment. That's what our long run aggregate supply curve always equals in the classical model. It equals our full output. And the price level can change to whatever level. So here, you can see that we've moved beyond. So we're at Y1. It's an increase from our previous output, our full employment output. And we also see that the price level is up. So the price level has also increased. We'll call that P1. But at this point, we're not at long run equilibrium. We are actually beyond our full employment output. So we are producing more than we're really capable of producing. We're straining our resources too much to produce this extra output. So the inputs, the resources, things like fuel, raw materials, those are getting squeezed. They're being overused. So the price of those will eventually have to go up. And as that happens, we will bring ourselves back to the long run equilibrium. So those input prices gradually move up, and we return back to our long run equilibrium. And we can call that P2. And this is where we will end up. So in this model, you'll see that even though there's a short-run shift in output, in the long run we have to come back to our full employment output level, since there's nothing shifting our capacity to produce more in the long run. And as a result, prices have simply increased, and in the long run we've come back to our old output level. Now let's take a look what happens when there's a shift on the supply side. So let's clear this. So again, we're going to have our aggregate demand, short-run supply curve. This is what it looks like if you curve it. Some models use a curved line. Our textbook does. Other textbooks don't. It really, for the purposes of finding our equilibrium points, it doesn't matter, since we're going to incorporate the long-run supply curve separately. And here's our long-run supply curve. All right, so we have all of our labels. Now for aggregate supply shifts, there are some things that shift it in the long run, and some things that shift it in the short run, and some things that shift it in both. So things that shift the aggregate supply would be a change in input prices. Those prices can either be changed temporarily or they could be changed permanently. If you think of oil as a great example, sometimes it fluctuates and it might be high or very low for a short period of time, and that will affect your short-run supply curve. Other times the price of oil might change permanently because there's a fundamental change in the market, and that would affect our long-run aggregate supply. Change in technology. Usually changes in technology are permanent, so those would affect our short-run and our long-run supply curves. Change in availability of raw materials, which is somewhat related to our input prices. A change in corporate taxes will have an impact on costs for firms. Those changes in tax rates could either be permanent or they could be temporary. And a change in labor supply, which is also related to availability of raw materials. If you think of labor supply as an input for firms, if they have now more access to labor, labor will be cheaper. And the vice versa would be true. If there's less access to labor, then it would become more expensive. So we can take a look at a shift, or we can take a look at two shifts, one in the short run and one in the long run. So let's imagine that oil prices increase temporarily. Let's, for example, like Hurricane Katrina, that was a temporary shock to the oil market, and that would have been a short-lived price bump. So that would only affect our short-run aggregate supply curve. So our aggregate supply curve would shift in because costs have increased as a result of that occurrence. So we move from our original price level, P, and our full employment output in the long run, and now we are at this short-run equilibrium. And you see that P has increased to P1, and our output Y has decreased to Y1. What this does is it puts us in a supply-side shock. So eventually, prices of this will come back down, and all that will happen is we will go back to our equilibrium here, where long run equals aggregate demand, as these input prices start to come down, because this is just a temporary shock. So this moves out as those oil prices come down, and then eventually those oil prices will go back to their long run equilibrium, and we will return back to our long run equilibrium at this point. Now if we want to consider an instance where our long run supply curve shifts, Technology is a great example of that. So an invention like the internet has changed the costs of businesses permanently. Costs for businesses are decreased with inventions like the internet, computer technology. So that would be a permanent shift in our long-run supply curve. So if we show that here, so our long-run supply curve shifts. And now we see that we have a new equilibrium point in the long run. So our new full employment output will be over here. So we can call that full employment output prime. So that shift will bring prices down in the long run, P2, and it will increase, as you can see, it will increase our ability to produce goods and services in the long run. Now for your homework, you might have to see shifts on the supply side and the demand side at the same time. Sometimes if they have opposite effects, you might not know which effect is stronger, and that's just an assumption you'll have to make and show in your graph, or say that it's indeterminate, meaning that if the shift in aggregate demand is pushing prices down, but the shift in aggregate supply is pushing prices up, you can't determine what the result will be because you don't know which effect is stronger. So you'll be able to explain that in your homework for our week 4 discussion. And you'll also be able to show, using this model, where the equilibrium price and quantity end up in the short run and where it ends up in the long run.